When Tasha K pressed upload, she didn't just release another clip. She shifted the energy around Claressa Shields completely. Because when Tasha K framed her latest claims, it wasn't loud accusations or messy gossip. It was calculated, calm, almost surgical. She talked about timelines, overlaps, patterns that didn't add up unless you stopped looking at them as coincidence. And that's when everything changed. Within hours, Claressa went off, not with tears, but with fire. Fans noticed it instantly. The tone, the urgency, the edge. This wasn't the usual composed, unbothered champion energy. This was someone responding to something that hit too close to home. And once clips started circulating, the internet split in real time. One side said Claressa had every right to be angry. That being talked about publicly, especially when you've stayed silent, feels like a line being crossed. They argued this was a woman defending her name, her strength, and her boundaries. The other side saw something different. They said this reaction didn't look like confidence. It looked like pressure. That when someone reacts this strongly, it's usually not about what was said. It's about what was confirmed. And suddenly, people weren't just talking about Tasha K anymore. They were rewatching old moments, old posts, old interviews, looking for context that suddenly felt heavier. What made this moment explode wasn't just Claressa's response. It was the silence around Papoose. No detailed denial, no long explanation, just distance. And that contrast, her intensity versus his restraint, became the real story. Because when one person goes off and the other slows down, fans don't ask who's right. They ask why now. Stay locked in, because this wasn't just a reaction. It was the sound of a narrative breaking under pressure. When Tasha K released her latest commentary, it didn't arrive as chaos. It arrived as context. Calm delivery, careful phrasing, no rush to shock. And that's exactly why the reaction from Claressa Shields felt so immediate and so intense. This wasn't the internet dragging a celebrity into noise. This was a moment where the story pressed back. According to Tasha K's framing, the issue wasn't one rumor or one misstep. It was a pattern that only becomes visible when you line moments up side by side. She talked about timing, about overlaps, about behavior that looks normal in isolation, but reads differently once you step back. She didn't present conclusions. She presented questions. And questions, when they land at the right moment, can be louder than accusations. Claressa's response was swift. Not emotional in the way people expect, not tears or breakdowns, but defensive energy, direct, heated, purposeful. Fans noticed the shift immediately. This wasn't the usual unbothered champion tone. This was someone responding to something that struck a nerve. And that's where the divide began. Supporters argued that Claressa had every reason to go off. Being discussed publicly, especially after choosing silence, can feel like a violation. They saw her reaction as boundaries being enforced in real time. A strong woman refusing to let someone else frame her story. So others interpreted it differently. They said this didn't look like control. It looked like pressure. Pressure that builds when a narrative you've managed carefully starts to slip outside your control. And once that idea took hold, the internet began rewatching everything with new eyes. Old posts felt heavier. Old captions felt defensive. Old interviews sounded more guarded. This is how stories evolve. Not with new information, but with reinterpretation. What made this moment especially volatile was the contrast. Claressa's intensity was loud, but the response, or lack of response, from Papoose was quiet. No detailed denials, no counter-narrative, just distance and restraint. In situations like this, silence doesn't read as neutrality. It reads as strategy. Tasha K didn't frame that silence as guilt. She framed it as experience. When someone understands how narratives unravel, they often choose to slow everything down. The less you say, the fewer threads there are to pull, the fewer timelines there are to compare. And that imbalance, one voice loud, the other controlled, became the real tension point. Because when one person goes off and the other pulls back, fans don't ask who's right. They ask what changed. According to Tasha K's commentary, what changed was not the relationship itself, but the exposure of structure. She suggested that what people were reacting to wasn't a new allegation. It was the possibility that things were never as simple as they appeared. This is where Claressa's public strength became a double-edged sword. Strong people are assumed to be fine. Confident people are assumed to be certain. When they react emotionally, it disrupts expectations. People don't know how to process vulnerability from someone they've categorized as unshakable, so they look for explanations. Was she defending herself or defending a narrative? Was the anger about what was said or about what it confirmed? Was this reaction about reputation or about timing? Tasha K emphasized that reactions don't appear out of nowhere. They surface when pressure reaches a threshold, when private calculations collide with public commentary. She also pointed out something subtle that many missed. This wasn't a meltdown. It was controlled outrage. Words chosen carefully. Anger directed. Not chaos, but containment. Containment suggests someone still believes the situation can be managed. And that's important, because once management stops working, reactions change again. They either escalate or they disappear. By the end of part one thing became clear. This wasn't the start of the story. It was the shift. The moment when a narrative that had been stable suddenly felt unstable. When confidence met contradiction. When silence stopped insulating and started amplifying questions. This isn't about sides yet. It isn't about proof yet. It's about energy. Energy doesn't lie. It tells you when something has moved from background noise to personal impact. And whatever was said, however carefully it was framed, landed in a way that couldn't be ignored. And that's why this reaction mattered. Because once the energy shifts, the story doesn't move forward. It tightens. When the dust settled from Tasha K's explosive claims, the conversation didn't move toward evidence. It moved toward behavior. And according to many observers, that's where the story actually became harder to ignore. Because receipts can be debated. Timelines can be argued. But reactions reveal pressure. This is where Claressa Shields' response took on a different meaning. It wasn't just about anger. It was about urgency. The kind of urgency that appears when a narrative feels like it's slipping beyond your control. Claressa didn't react slowly. She reacted immediately. And that speed mattered. Fans noticed that this wasn't a carefully delayed response. It was instinctive, direct, sharp. Almost as if the commentary landed somewhere she wasn't prepared to have examined publicly. Supporters defended her fiercely. They argued that anyone would react strongly when their name is attached to allegations they didn't invite. Especially when those allegations come from someone with a history of stirring controversy. From that perspective, Claressa wasn't unraveling. She was setting boundaries. But critics focused on something else. They pointed out that confident people usually don't rush to explain. They wait. They let clarity do the work. And the speed of Claressa's response made them wonder whether this was less about offense and more about containment. Containment is a key word here. Containment doesn't mean lying. It means trying to keep something from spreading further. And according to the way fans interpreted the moment, Claressa's reaction looked like someone trying to stop a story before it fully formed in the public imagination. This interpretation gained traction largely because of the contrast with Papoose. While Claressa was vocal, Papoose was noticeably restrained. No extended statements, no emotional rebuttals, no detailed explanations, just minimal presence. Enough to show awareness, but not enough to give anything concrete to analyze. That imbalance became the center of the narrative. When one person reacts loudly and the other stays quiet, people don't automatically side with either one. They start asking why the reactions are so different. Tasha K's framing amplified that curiosity. She suggested that silence, in situations like this, isn't always confusion. Sometimes it's experience. When someone understands how narratives unravel, they know the most dangerous thing they can do is say too much. Every explanation creates a timeline. Every timeline invites comparison. Every comparison opens the door to contradiction, so silence becomes a shield. But silence also creates space for interpretation. And in that space, fans begin connecting dots, not always accurately, but persistently. Old interviews are replayed, past social media posts are reread. Moments that once felt insignificant start feeling intentional. This is where part 2 becomes less about truth and more about perception. According to media analysts, public figures don't just manage facts, they manage energy. And the energy around Claressa shifted the moment she went off. The confidence people expected turned into defensiveness. The calm turned into urgency. That doesn't prove anything, but it changes how people watch. Tasha K leaned into this idea carefully. She didn't say Claressa's reaction confirmed allegations. She said it confirmed pressure, and pressure only exists when something matters deeply. She also addressed a key misunderstanding. Strong reactions don't always come from guilt. They often come from loss of control. When someone feels their narrative is being shaped by someone else, anger becomes a way to reclaim agency. That interpretation resonated with many viewers. Claressa wasn't reacting to facts. She was reacting to framing, because framing determines how a story is remembered long after the details fade. Another factor that fueled the divide was timing. Claressa's reaction came at a moment when fans were already primed to question. Social media thrives on momentum. Once a story reaches a certain velocity, any response becomes part of the spectacle. And spectacle is hard to shut down. Tasha K's commentary, whether intentional or not, arrived at a moment when audiences were more skeptical of polished narratives. People were already conditioned to look for subtext, for what's not being said. So when Claressa went off, it didn't silence questions. It multiplied them. Why now? Why this tone? Why not earlier? Why not later? These questions didn't require answers to circulate. They lived in comment sections, reaction videos, and side-by-side clip comparisons. By the end of part 2, the story had shifted again. It was no longer about what Tasha K claimed. It was about how Claressa responded, and how Papoose didn't. This phase of the narrative is where sides harden. Supporters see strength under attack. Skeptics see pressure leaking through composure. Both believe they're reading the situation correctly. And that's the danger of reaction-driven stories. Once perception overtakes facts, clarity becomes harder to restore. This is why part 2 matters. Because this is the point where the internet stops waiting for receipts and starts deciding what it believes based on behavior alone. And once that happens, silence and intensity don't just communicate emotion, they shape legacy. By the time the conversation reached this stage, the story around Claressa Shields was no longer being driven by claims alone. It was being driven by psychology. Not what was said, but how people responded to pressure, and how those responses were interpreted by millions watching in real time. According to analysts who study public narratives, there's a predictable moment in every controversy when facts stop leading and emotions take over. This was that moment. Claressa's reaction wasn't just loud, it was protective. Protective of her name, her work, her strength. And that matters. Because defensive energy usually appears when someone feels their identity, not just their reputation, is being reframed by someone else. That's the difference between anger and defense. Anger pushes outward. Defense pulls inward, then pushes back. Fans who supported Claressa saw this clearly. They argued that being discussed publicly, especially by a commentator like Tasha K, would trigger anyone. In their eyes, Claressa wasn't unraveling. She was drawing a line, refusing to let her story be told without her consent. But critics focused on something subtler: timing. They asked why this reaction came now. Why not earlier, when rumors first circulated? Why not later, after things cooled down? The immediacy of the response suggested the commentary struck something current, something unresolved. And that's where psychology comes in. When people react quickly, it's often because the threat feels present, not historical. It doesn't feel like something you've already processed. It feels like something you're still managing. This interpretation gained traction largely because of the continued restraint from Papoose. While Claressa's voice was strong and direct, his remained minimal. No extended statements, no emotional counterpoints, just distance and control. That contrast created a powerful narrative imbalance. In public storytelling, silence is often mistaken for weakness. But in reality, silence can function as power, especially when the other side is reacting emotionally. The quieter one appears more composed, regardless of the facts. Tasha K leaned into this dynamic without stating it outright. She suggested that silence isn't always avoidance. Sometimes it's confidence that time will do the work. When someone believes the narrative will stabilize on its own, they don't rush to intervene. This doesn't confirm guilt or innocence, but it shapes perception. And perception is the currency of the internet. Part 3 is where fans stopped debating what was true and started debating who looked more in control. Control became the metric, not receipts, not timelines, just energy. Claressa's energy was intense, focused, reactive. Papoose's energy was restrained, minimal, calculated. Neither approach is wrong, but they communicate different things. Psychologists often describe this as a stress response mismatch. One person externalizes pressure, the other internalizes it. When these two styles collide publicly, audiences almost always interpret the quieter one as more stable. That doesn't mean they are. It just means they appear to be. This is where Claressa's public strength became a liability. People expect champions to remain unshaken. When a champion shows emotion, the internet doesn't read it as humanity. It reads it as vulnerability. And vulnerability invites speculation. Speculation then turns into narrative. Tasha K's commentary benefited from this moment, not because she added new information, but because she reframed existing reactions. She didn't need to prove anything. She let the reactions speak for themselves. And that's dangerous territory, because once a story becomes reaction-driven, it's no longer controlled by facts, it's controlled by interpretation, by tone, by who seems calm and who seems pressed. By the end of Part 3, the internet wasn't asking, "What did Tasha K say?" It was asking, "Why did this hit so hard?" And that question lingered. It lingered because strong reactions don't come from nowhere. They come from stakes, from something that still matters deeply. And whether viewers interpreted Claressa's response as justified defense or visible pressure, one thing became undeniable. This wasn't resolved. The silence hadn't closed the chapter. The reaction hadn't ended the debate. It had only sharpened it. And that's why Part 3 marks a turning point. Because once a story becomes about control versus reaction, the next phase isn't argument, it's decision. By the time the story reached this phase, one thing was clear. Reactions had done all they could do. According to observers following the situation closely, no amount of going off, clapping back, or setting the record straight was going to reset the narrative the way it once could. This is the point where public pressure stops being loud and starts being heavy. For Claressa Shields, the reaction phase had already played out. Her voice had been heard. Her frustration was visible. Her boundaries were clear. But instead of closing the conversation, that visibility changed its shape. Because once a reaction becomes part of the story, it no longer controls the story. At this stage, silence and speech both carry consequences. Speaking again risks escalation. Every additional response becomes another clip, another headline, another moment for interpretation. Silence, on the other hand, risks being read as retreat, or worse, confirmation. And this is where the choice becomes unavoidable. Or also, according to commentary surrounding Tasha K's role, her influence wasn't rooted in what she said next. It was rooted in what she didn't need to say anymore. The conversation had momentum. Reactions were circulating on their own. The internet had already begun filling in blanks. This is the phase where narratives stop needing fuel. And that's dangerous, because when a story can survive without new information, it's no longer dependent on truth, it's dependent on belief. And belief is shaped by patterns, not proof. For Claressa, this meant every move forward carried amplified weight. Appearing less could be interpreted as avoidance. Appearing more could be interpreted as damage control. Either way, the audience would read meaning into absence and presence alike. Meanwhile, Papooses' continued restraint created a different kind of tension. The quieter he remained, the more his silence was interpreted as intentional. Not accidental, not overwhelmed. Intentional. And in public storytelling, intentional silence often reads as confidence, regardless of whether that confidence is real. This imbalance forced the conversation into a new space: decision-making. At this point, the internet wasn't waiting for clarification. It was waiting for direction, not from commentators, but from behavior. Who would disengage? Who would double down? Who would let the story fade? And who would try to reshape it? Analysts often describe this moment as the identity fork. It's where public figures must choose which version of themselves they're willing to live with long-term. The reactive defender, the silent strategist, the one who walks away without explanation, or the one who reclaims the narrative at the cost of reopening wounds. None of those options are clean. Jaguar Wright's earlier framing hovered over this phase even without her actively speaking. Her core suggestion, that systems collapse slowly, not loudly, seemed to play out in real time. There was no explosion, just compression. Conversations slowed, coverage shifted, but the tension didn't disappear. It condensed. This is also where fans begin to experience fatigue. Not boredom, fatigue. The emotional exhaustion of holding opposing interpretations at the same time. Supporters want closure, critics want accountability, and silence satisfies neither. That's why Part 4 matters. Because this is the phase where most public stories quietly end, not with answers, but with distance. Less interaction, less reinforcement. A gradual redirection of attention elsewhere. Not because the story was resolved, but because it became unsustainable to keep carrying. For Claressa, the pressure wasn't just public, it was personal. Public identity and private emotion rarely align during moments like this. Maintaining composure costs energy. Choosing silence costs clarity. Choosing speech costs peace. And that's the trade-off no headline can capture. By the end of Part 4, one truth stood out. This story could no longer be managed through reaction alone. Whatever came next wouldn't be about defending or denying. It would be about moving differently. And when movement replaces reaction, the story enters its final phase. By the time a story reaches its final phase, nothing dramatic needs to happen for everything to be understood. According to how these moments usually unfold, resolution doesn't arrive as an announcement. It arrives as a pattern. That's where this story landed. For Claressa Shields, the noise had already peaked. Reactions had been made. Lines had been drawn. The internet had done what it always does: picked sides, replayed clips, and projected meaning into every pause. What remained wasn't outrage, it was observation. Because once reactions stop, people stop listening to words and start watching movement. Movement tells you who's disengaging. Movement tells you what's no longer being defended. Movement tells you when a chapter is closing without being labeled as such. This is where silence becomes communicative in a different way. Earlier, silence functioned as strategy, containment, restraint, control. But over time, silence begins to signal direction, less reinforcement, less visibility, less emotional investment in correcting narratives that once mattered deeply. According to commentary surrounding this phase, public figures often choose one of three paths: fade, reduce visibility, stop feeding the cycle, allow attention to drift elsewhere without confrontation, fracture, let distance speak, accept that alignment no longer exists, even if it's never formally stated. Reset, reclaim narrative through a different focus, new goals, new priorities, new framing that doesn't require revisiting the past. What they rarely choose is explanation. Explanations invite scrutiny. Scrutiny invites contradiction. Contradiction extends the lifespan of the story, so most endings are quiet. In this case, observers noted how the energy shifted from confrontation to withdrawal. Not avoidance, withdrawal. The kind that happens when defending no longer feels worth the cost. When the image you were protecting starts demanding more than it gives back. The contrast between voices remained telling. Papoose maintained restraint, minimal engagement, no escalation. Over time, that restraint stopped reading as tension and started reading as finality. Not because anything was confirmed, but because nothing was being continued. And that's how many stories truly end. Not with closure, but with replacement. Attention moves, new topics emerge, algorithms shift, but the people at the center carry the impact longer than the audience ever will. Decisions get made off camera, boundaries get redrawn privately, identities recalibrate without commentary. This is why the word collapse was always misleading. There was no public meltdown, no viral confession, no dramatic reckoning. What collapsed was illusion. The illusion that strength guarantees protection. The illusion that silence always preserves peace. The illusion that public narratives reflect private reality. Once those illusions fall, there's nothing left to argue about. According to analysts, this is the most uncomfortable ending for audiences, because it offers no verdict, no winner, no villain. Just a slow acknowledgement that something shifted, and it's not going back. And that discomfort is intentional, because real life doesn't resolve like entertainment. It resolves like distance, like changed behavior, like a refusal to keep playing a role that no longer fits. By the end of this phase, the internet had largely moved on. But the imprint remained, not in headlines, but in how future moments would be interpreted, how reactions would be measured, how silence would be read. That's the lasting effect of stories like this. They don't end loudly. They reframe how everything that comes after is understood. And in that sense, this wasn't a story about outrage or exposure. It was a story about power, perception, and the cost of being publicly strong while privately recalibrating. The final takeaway is simple, but uncomfortable. When a narrative stops being defended, it's not because it was false or true. It's because it stopped being worth the emotional price. And that's how stories really end. So here's the real question. What did you actually witness? Was this about anger or about pressure finally surfacing? See, was Claressa's reaction a moment of justified defense or the weight of a narrative slipping out of her control? And when one voice goes off while the other stays silent, who do you believe is holding the power? This story didn't end with proof. It didn't end with denial. It ended the way most real stories do, with distance, changed energy, and unanswered questions. And that's why it stuck. Because silence isn't empty, it's communicative. Because reactions don't lie, they reveal stakes. And because when someone stops defending something they once protected loudly, that shift speaks louder than any statement ever could. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Claressa's reaction feel like strength or strain? Did silence protect the truth or protect the image? And do stories like this fade because they're false or because they're too complicated to resolve publicly? If this breakdown made you pause, share it. If it made you uncomfortable, that's the point. And if you're still here, it's because you know there's more beneath the surface than whatever reaches the timeline. Stay locked in, subscribe, keep watching closely, because the real stories don't end when the internet moves on. They just wait until the next moment makes everything click.